fans, wherever you may be, welcome back for another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. Join your host, Bill Alvstad, and co-host, sports writer and football analyst Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football.
Hey, Seahawks fans. Welcome back to another episode of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. Welcome in Keith, co-host Keith Myers, doing a 2023 salary cap show to give us all the numbers that we're looking for that we have to play within in the offseason here for free agency. Seattle comes in with a certain amount of money to spend, and we're going to find out if we can manipulate that at all, what that means as far as signing players, what we have available, who might be coming back on restricted tenders and so forth. Hey, how you doing, man?
Doing good. So the Seahawks appear to be in pretty good shape with like 31 million. They're sitting there to spend, but there's more to that than what's going on, because when you start looking at all the contracts and how few players are still under contract for next year, that's going to evaporate pretty quick. So I think we should just dive into this, because
for sure.
It's a complicated topic, and if this isn't your thing, just kind of bear with us a little bit. We are going to talk some numbers, but we're also going to try and keep it, ballparked, so that we're not getting into the weeds of, certain pennies and whatnot.
We can get into the weeds later on. The interesting thing, and this is the fun part for us, and I think everyone's that's kind of followed us for 6 or 7 years that we've been on here know that this is kind of our wonky kind of part of the season, off season, if you will. We don't really take it off to come in and kind of take a look at this stuff: roster building, contracts, cap space, NFL draft, all that stuff we really kind of get into and enjoy. And so what we try to do is we try to set up these shows beginning in the off season. We did roster evaluations just so we kind of know where the roster's at. Then we take a look at salary cap. We know where we're at. And then we want to take a look at some key contracts, specifically Geno Smith. We're going to do that in the next show, because that's going to be the biggest thing that needs to fall in place in order for the Seahawks to be able to kind of know what they're doing. And then we'll get into player evaluations for the NFL draft and so on and so forth, all the way to the end of April when the draft takes place. So let's start. Okay, I have a question for you right off the bat. So, several weeks back, we had a show. I think we initially talked about some salary cap stuff. And I just remember having the salary cap number figure that we were talking about throwing around. It was around $52 million. Now it's listed at 31.2. What's happened? If you can tell everybody kind of what's happened between, 6 weeks ago in the NFL versus now it's down to 31. What's going on?
So there's a lot of things that have happened. For starters, you see Damian Lewis hit the escalator in his contract. He had certain conditions. I believe it was snaps played, that if he reaches it, then he would get a raise. And that kicked in. So he used up about another, $1.5 million of cap space, based on his performance. They've re-signed kicker Jason Myers to a rather lucrative deal for a kicker, but he
second highest paid kicker in the NFL now.
He has been absolutely money. Even from like very long distance, he missed 3 kicks all year, one of which was the last kick of the regular season of the last game right at the end of the thing. But then he came back and got redemption at the end. So he'd only missed 2 kicks up to that point. Guys have had a phenomenal year. So getting him back under contract was key. And then you've got a whole bunch of other guys that you have to start counting for. Now they signed all these guys to what we call them futures contracts, because technically the contract doesn't kick in until the league year starts in the first week of March, but they are signed there. And so went ahead and you take all of those guys and you count in their salary. And it doesn't sound like much, because it's like $500,000 there, $750,000 there, but you get enough players and it starts to add up. And that gets you down into that realm. And then the other thing that you have to consider is now that we know what draft picks the Seahawks have, like not just, oh, they're going to have 2 first, but we know that it's going to be the 5th and the 20th. And so because of the way the rookie salary structure is put together, we know what those players are going to cost. And
And
even
a good
if,
portion of those are guaranteed right
yeah,
out of the gate.
and even if the Seahawks move down or move up or move around, you know what I mean? Like those, that number will get adjusted, but we still know what they are, at least as of right now. So we're going to account for those. And so those
And
numbers are set.
and that's not off the 31 that we're starting with. So we have to account for that. That's roughly about $14 million right now that the Seahawks are going to invest immediately in the draft salaries, drafted players that we have coming in. The NFL starting their salary cap at $220 million this year, which is a pretty decent increase from where it was. It was expected to be about this. It hasn't come out officially, but multiple projections out there are indicating that it's going to be right in this ballpark. Seattle's team cap space, as we said, is $31,240,644. This is before any cuts, any restructures, any tenders. This and doesn't account for the drafted players. So, and it doesn't account for a Geno Smith move, for example, which would be a big hit if they went high on the salary, the guaranteed salary, if they had to do a franchise tag, for example. It just doesn't seem doable. We'll talk about all that. We're going to set up a show specifically about Geno Smith's contract and what Keith and I think that might come in at. And we'll do that in the next show. But for now, let's just take a look at this thing.
One thing to keep in mind is that during this season, all the players under contract, all the players on the practice squad, all the players on injured reserve, everybody counts towards the cap. During the off season, only the top 51 contracts count. So there will be a point in here where we're looking at this, and it might feel like the Seahawks are over the cap, but they won't be, because a bunch of the contracts won't count towards the cap. And then what will happen is they'll get to a spot in probably after June 1st, and they'll make a big cut, someone like Jamal Adams, and that'll push them not only down under the cap, but way under, so they can have some wiggle room in case injuries happen and they got to bring other guys up onto the active roster.
Yeah. So I think what I thought I'd do is let's just start with the restricted guys first. There's, we talked briefly right before the show, there's really only one, possibly two, that would be applicable here. Ryan Neal is the name, restricted free agent. Seattle has an opportunity to go out there and kind of set his value, probably with a second round tender. That's going to cost Seattle about $4 million in cap, 4.3 to be exact. And possibly Tanner Muse. And after that, I just don't really think that's going to come into play there. It might, but the way that this thing's falling out and the way that the salary cap is going to be impacted, I'm not exactly sure that they do that. But Ryan Neal, they definitely want back. And at $4 million, he's a great value, one of the best strong safeties in the league. So we have to account for that, I think.
Yeah. And so that one, if they tender him that contract of 4.3 million, that's kind of the floor of a contract for him, because he gets that. It's fully guaranteed.
Unless they sign him for a multi-year deal. If they sign him for a multi-year deal, they could manipulate that number down in the first year.
Yep. But at least, like I said, they'll tender him at that, because then even if another team wants him and they sign it, they offer him a big contract, Seattle can either match the big contract and keep him, or they can let him go and get a second round pick from that team. So that's likely. I don't see them doing that with Tanner Muse, just simply because the guy played in a couple of games, and he's a middle linebacker that you can, he was not a special player anyway. He's a guy that only saw the field because of injuries. I can't imagine them actually tendering him a contract. That doesn't mean he won't be back. He'll be non-tendered. That way they're not on the books for almost $3 million worth of salary for him. And then they'll re-sign him for, just above the league minimum. It's like $820,000. And that's a big deal as far as, that difference there. So the other guys, I honestly, Tony Jones won't come back. Penny Hart, he might be re-signed, but he will not be tendered because he was active and played a lot this year and did nothing. So those are the guys that I just feel it's Ryan Neal and that's it as far as the restricted free agents. Interestingly, interesting to me are the exclusive rights free agents. These are the guys who they're not under contract, they're free agents, but because they have less than 3 years in the league, and as far as you know, accrued time, they can't negotiate with anyone but Seattle, which means Seattle can basically say, if you want to be in the league, here's a contract for the minimum or maybe slightly above. And if you say no, well, you can't sign with anyone else. So um, good luck with that. And they always
Right.
come back. I mean,
Yeah.
these are players that typically were struggling to make a roster last year, not they don't have a great value. They're just hoping for a shot to catch on with the team and maybe make an impact. I say that, but there's a player in that exclusive rights area that is more than that. And that would be Michael Jackson, cornerback, starter, only 26 years old, played 93.6% of the snaps, big time contributor to Seattle's defense. And he's an exclusive rights free agent. So they're going to get one more year of him on the cheap before they have to start paying him. They might not want to just go that route. They might want to make this a 2 or 3 year deal, and where they can keep his number down, not just this coming year, but the year after and the year after that by guaranteeing him some salary.
Yeah. And if he continues to start, it's only going to get more expensive. So to lock him in now would be great. If we tender him, at an exclusive right number, it's going to be right around $850,000, which is a great value for a starting corner in the NFL. And given Seattle's cap situation, I would think that's a no-brainer for the team. Mm-hmm. Okay. So before we get to guys that maybe are cap casualties and all that kind of stuff, is there anything else regarding unrestricted guys or restricted guys that you think that that we're gonna definitely want back, and we have to kind of earmark a number for them?
So with restricted and exclusive rights, we talked about those. As far as unrestricted, there's a ton of guys we definitely want back. Whether or not they come back is up to them and the team and a lot of things. I mean, you already mentioned Geno Smith. That's the huge one. But Poona Ford fits in there. Phil Haynes fits in there. Marquise Goodwin, the wide receiver, perhaps.
Rashad Penny, perhaps. He's only 27 years old.
Yeah,
had a
Cody
big number last year, 5.7.
Cody Barton is another
Cody
guy.
Barton is a big one. Yes,
one of the two long snappers, whether it be Carson Tinker or Tyler Ott.
Yes, yes.
It's so weird to actually talk about long snappers, but one of them will come back.
Yes.
So yeah, there are guys that this team wants. Austin Blythe, maybe, if they get shut out of signing a better player.
Nick Bellore, who knows? They're paying an awful lot to Nick Bellore for being Nick Bellore. There seems to me to be a guy out there that's not 34, 35 years old, as Nick Bellore is going to be in 2023, to be able to make the league minimum and do the job that he's doing. Phil Haynes, another guy that they seem to like. Pete loves Phil Haynes. Now, he doesn't pencil out, in Pro Football Focus and some of the other metrics as far as offensive line performance, but they love him and his ability to play a couple different spots. And Pete seems to think he's kind of starter level. And we've never really completely seen that in having it actually show up on the field. So I'm not exactly sure how that translates into a new contract for him.
Yeah, he struggled with injuries the first couple of years of his career. This year, he actually got pretty good playing time, basically rotating with Gabe Jackson, which the team did in order to get him on the field. And, he played 44% of the snaps, which is quite a lot. The thing is, he looked good at times. He was certainly better than Gabe Jackson, who was really not good. But he wasn't like, Haynes was not a guy that you're like, oh, there's the guy, we have to re-sign him. He's a he's a guy we want on our offensive line for the next 5 years. He was average. He was a replaceable player. But at the same time, the coaches like him. They like his attitude. They like the way he works, and they'd love to have him back. He also made $2.5 million this year, and is is an unrestricted free agent. He might come back on a deal that's actually less than that.
So, okay. So we've kind of established that we're, everything that we've just talked about, draft picks, et cetera, restricted guys, we're going to end up with a very small number at the end of the day to go out and find free agents, and sign Geno, and et cetera. So we don't know exactly what Geno's number is going to be. It could be anywhere from, on the low end, just say 15, 12, 15 million a year, especially like on a first year cap hit. I think that's something that could possibly be doable. Up to, you hear talk about contract valuation for him at 32 to 35 million, which I think is completely unrealistic, but nonetheless, it's a possibility given the quarterback market and the franchise tag coming into play, which I think would be completely unwise for Seattle to use, but it is in play. If they don't want to lose him and they can't sign him to a deal, they could use that. Hold on a sec. We don't have enough money to do any of those things with Geno Smith alone, let alone anybody else out there. And we need to build the roster in free agency. So we're going to talk more extensively on this Geno Smith question. It's a big one. But if the team needs to generate more cap flexibility, Keith, where are they going to look to be able to do that?
There's not a lot of places to generate a lot of cap space, just by the nature of some of the contracts where they're sitting and all that kind of stuff. The biggest one that as far as contracts go would be Quandre Diggs, where they could generate $9.9 million in cap space by just straight out cutting him. Now that does lead to $8.2 million in dead money, but it's an $18.1 million cap hit. So that 9.9, if you can replace his production for less than $10 million, you could make that move. And so to me, I look at that and I go, that's the biggest chunk, but it's probably not. I don't know if it's the most likely. More likely,
I think a restructure on that might be more likely.
Yeah,
they like Quandre Diggs.
The most likely one for me would be Gabe Jackson, who, as I said, he was great a year ago. This year, his performance dropped off considerably. He's starting to show his age a little bit, and that $6.5 million of cap space for a guy that essentially lost his starter job. Now he continued to start, but he didn't play starter snaps because he was rotated out in almost every game. That $6.5 million starts to look really attractive if you're John Snyder.
Yeah, here's a guy that surrendered 34 quarterback pressures, 4 sacks on only 433 pass protection reps.
Mm-hmm. And that's supposed to be what he's good at, is pass protection. And it was what he was good at a year ago, and it was what he was good at when he was with the Raiders. But this year, it just was not a good fit.
Now, releasing him is going to save $6.5 million against the cap. It's going to leave you with a dead cap hit of 4.7, but nonetheless, the savings is there. Seahawks going to need that money. I don't know how they want to address this particular spot, right guard, in free agency or the draft. Now, if they give up Gabe Jackson, they've got to replace him. So if you're going to go out and sign anybody in free agency, it's likely that spot may be just as expensive or more expensive than that cap number in order to get replacement level in here. So
well, it depends.
I think they'll upgrade that in the draft, but nonetheless, you got to solve it kind of before the draft.
If they can re-sign Phil Haynes, I think they'll be able to sign him for less than that number. And
if you thought that you could start Curhan at right guard and sign Phil Haynes to be the kind of the backup, then that makes sense to me. But do you want Phil Haynes starting? Do you want to sign him to a starting level contract?
Well, I mean, you sign him to the contract you need to get him under the roster, and then you see if he's can beat out a rookie to start.
Yes,
Um,
I think that that's
so
fair.
I don't think you sign him to a quote unquote starter level. I think you sign him to, you know, a contract, 2-year, $4 million total contract, 4.5, whatever it ends up being, and you let Gabe Jackson go because you've got Curhan, who
Okay.
can play the position at least as a run blocker, and you've got um, now you've got a guy that has played 44% of the snaps, even though he wasn't a starter, and
And
did
you
the
saved a
job at
little bit of money.
it did that he did Haynes did the job better than Jackson did, and you saved 6.5 million. So I think that it's one of those things where you can easily make that move, especially when you go into the draft saying we're going to get a guard. We're not going to get a guard at the first round or the second round, but somewhere in the
Oh,
middle
maybe in
rounds.
the second round.
Well, it might, but I'm saying you don't have to there because you've
Yes,
got a
you've got
potential
an answer.
starter. You've got a
Yes.
potential starter there, so you're not like, oh, we have to get this one or we're screwed. And then if you get one in the fourth round or whatever, and you save $6.5 million toward the cap, like that's why I think that's the most likely move that the Seahawks make is cutting Gabe Jackson loose. And there's lots of others. Quentin Jefferson, they could get almost
Yeah.
$4.5
Yeah.
for
Shelby
cutting
Harris
him.
is the most interesting name to me because Shelby Harris is not a bad player. He's got a big
Mm-mm.
number though, $12.2 million. This is the biggest number I think that Seattle could potentially move from if they so chose. However, I think that, the entire defensive line gets a bad rap because we had such a poor rush defense, and pass rushing at times. Shelby Harris is part of that. But if you look at him individually as an individual player, he was probably one of the most steady, best players that we had along the defensive line. He, was the 15th overall among 60 qualified defensive tackles, according to Pro Football Focus, with 518 defensive snaps. He registered a pair of sacks. He reached 30 quarterback pressures, generated 4 pass breakups. He was pretty decent in setting the edge, at least on his side. And so
Yeah, so
it's
he's the guy.
possible that you could cut him and save that money, or you could restructure him
I
and
don't
extend him
I don't think that you can replace him for $9 million, which is what the cap
in the
savings
in
is.
the draft. You could, but
I
then
mean,
you're looking at an unknown quantity.
yeah, but I mean, as far as not in the draft, but just in free agency, I don't think you can replace him for the cap savings. So if you need cap savings from him, then yeah, that's the thing is you go in. He's in the last year of his contract next year. You give him another year, you give him another 2 years, and you stretch some of that money out. You take that 12 million he's set to earn, and you turn a lot of it into the signing bonus of his new contract. So you spread that 12 million out over 3 years, and you drop that down to 4, and then so now his cap number ends up being 7 for next year, and
Yeah.
you have him for a couple more years, and I think that is a very likely scenario with Shelby Harris, just because of um, combination of quality of play and the fact that I don't think you can replace him for that savings, but they still need it.
Yeah, but he is going to be 32 in August. Played his first season with Seattle. There's not a huge amount of loyalty there. Seattle may view him as a replaceable player, although I agree with you. I just think that you'd be replacing one player with another. Maybe you do
Mhm.
that if you can get a guy that's 27 years old.
The other player that is in exactly the same boat in terms of cap hit, cap number, last going into the last year, all of that is Uchenna Nwosu, and there's no way he's getting cut. The guy was freaking incredibly good
Right.
last year, most reliable pass rusher they had all year. Um, but he's going to the last year of his contract,
And
and
he's got a $13 million number.
that $13 million number could come down if you extend him, and you want to extend him because he was
Yes.
freaking good. And
Yes.
so if you can extend him for another year, another 2 years, and get his cap number down under control into the 8-7 range, there's no downside. You just go for it and do it.
Yeah, I would offer him a 3-year extension, 4 years total, and I would
Mm-hmm.
manipulate that number down, especially the first year, let it go up next year. But this year, you really need that help because you possibly need to sign Geno. If you don't end up signing Geno moves on in free agency or whatever, then you've got some opportunity to work around that. Okay, so you mentioned Quentin Jefferson, Al Woods.
Al Woods at 3.5.
Al Woods is probably a no-brainer. Al Woods getting a little older now, missed some time. I think he is replaceable with someone that can come in, especially potentially a better scheme fit. I know Al Woods is kind of stout in there, but for a nose tackle, I don't know if he can hold up at this point in his career. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Brian Monet at 2.675 in savings.
The other one I wanted to talk to you about was Will Disley. Will Disley was extended last year. We both thought it was kind of a crazy level contract considering it was early in free agency and there was really no competition for that. But it is what it is. But his cap hit this year though is $9.1 million. And it's significant. Now you can't cut him, but if you restructured that, at least this year, there's some money there sitting if you push some of that out over a couple of years as bonus money. That would give you $4.5 million per year this year to work with Geno on.
Yeah, I mean that is an interesting scenario. I don't think you cut him because you can't replace him for $3 million, which is all the cap savings that you would get. You wouldn't want to cut him anyways. He's been good, and this is a guy that's produced on the field in terms of passing stats, but that's not even what he does best. His best attribute is that he's one of the best blocking tight ends in the entire NFL. I mean, they use him like a right tackle half the time, and he does that job incredibly well. So he's got a lot of value, and that's why they paid him what they did, was because you look across the league and he's actually right in line with his pay, because he's not a Travis Kelce, right? But he's in that next tier down. He's an elite blocker, and so
yeah, I'd say looking at Noah Fant and Will Disley, Noah Fant's the better pass catcher, but they both offer the same value to me as far as being on the team, special teams players. That tight end position I think was utilized finally this year in the offense really well. But that's just another opportunity to save some money. So, okay, let's just say we did, most of these moves that we just talked about, we could generate another $22 to $24 million.
Yep, there's one
in
more
savings.
There's one more, and that is to use the post June 1st designation on Jamal Adams. And
I totally forgot about Jamal
and save $11 million against the cap. Now, we already talked about Ryan Neal and what his cap hit's going to be at 4.3. Ryan Neal is the better player of those two. If you tender Ryan Neal and cut Jamal Adams using the post June 1st, you end up saving what is it, $6.7 million? 6.6.
Part of the trouble I think that Seattle is having that they're getting into this year is I fully believe that they were not expecting to have to pay a guy like Geno Smith or any quarterback this year. I think that they were going through a transition year next year. I think they were looking at the draft. I think they, or some other mid-tier kind of guy to bridge them. And Geno had this season, and I don't know that they had it budgeted this way. And now they're having to kind of rework that whole thing. So philosophically, I just want to, before we have this Geno conversation in the next show, but philosophically, Keith, what do you believe is the key to building this roster the way that it needs to be competitive, that's in a timeline that lines up with Pete Carroll in the rebuild and some of the new players that we've got, the draft class that we just had, the draft class that we're going to have, and the quarterback position in general?
The key to building this roster, I believe, is to draft a player like CJ Stroud or Will Levis with the 5th overall pick. so that way you can go back to having your starting quarterback on rookie salary money and therefore use the rest of your cap money to build the rest of the roster. Because this wasn't a complete roster. They need more help on defense. They need additional talent. And you're not going to do that by eating your entire, your entire cap hit on a quarterback that, yeah, he was good, but
he's not special.
He's not special.
Right.
He had, one fourth quarter, last minute comeback in all those games.
He's a top 15 quarterback.
He's slightly better than league average. And that was for 1 year, not counting the other years in his career. And we'll get into all that.
He's not the future. I mean, he's 32 years old. So
Yeah.
my bigger point is, it really does come down to strategy and roster building. Like, what does John Schneider do? He's got all this draft capital. He doesn't have too much money in free agency to make a huge splash, but they could do their typical utilitarian kind of third level free agency moves that they typically do. We've got money for that. We can generate money to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm telling you, if this Geno thing gets out of whack, or it comes in way higher than we thought, it could set the team back. So you end up with a situation where they think they're doing the right thing by paying a quarterback that's able to lead them into the playoffs, but they have left themselves so weak at multiple positions that they can't get any further than 8 or 9 wins. And it's a horrible place to be stuck in the NFL.
Yeah. So they are looking at a spot where because they've got so much work to do on the rest of the roster, especially on defense. And a lot of the guys that we talked about, as far as helping them generate cap space, right? Guys that might, end up disappearing as far as the cap stuff go. We're talking about guys like Shelby Harris or Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams. These are defensive players.
Yeah.
Right? Quentin
You got to
Jefferson,
replace
Al
them.
Woods.
They have to be replaced.
Yeah. And so you've already got a really bad defense. And
if you think you're going to replace them with rookies and somehow get better production than the guys that they just replaced, they're cheaper. Yeah. But there's no guarantees with rookies that they're going to come in and have an impact at all.
Yep. And so you look at that and you have to look and say, we can generate the cap stuff net left to, if you're going to pay Geno in the 30s, we can generate enough to do it. But you take what was already one of the league worst defenses, and then you're going to gut a bunch of talent from it and expect to rebuild it in the draft. And honestly, I don't believe that is good roster management. That's not good roster building for a quarterback who's going to be 33 next year.
So that's the preview.
And you have the 5th overall pick of the draft.
Yeah, right. So so that's the preview of the conversation that we're going to have with Geno, because it's not as simple as it seems. It's a very complex move.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the very first moves that's going to happen in free agency. We're talking, this thing could be signed anytime. They could sign a contract anytime, but as we move closer to March 15th, which is a date that you kind of want to watch, where free agency really starts to ramp up. But you want to watch like 14 days prior to that, because that's where franchise tags come into play. And of course, I think we'll see, we'll hear about rumors and so forth before that. But these cuts and restructures can happen anytime between now and then. So it'll be very interesting. It might give a hint as to where they're going with all of this. So fascinating conversation. I don't know exactly what we accomplished today other than scaring people. we started with 31 million. By the time we got done with the conversation, we were at 10 million, and we kind of brought it back up a little bit by cutting some players, but we know we're going to have to replace those players. So it is somewhat complex, and we'll hope to provide more clarity as we walk through this in the next 6 weeks or so before we get to free agency, because man, it's fascinating. I love this stuff.
And I know that for some people, they just hear numbers, right? And they're just like, these numbers don't mean anything to me. And I get that. But when you're talking about roster building, it's all about the production that you get at the cost that you take. And if you can get 80% of the production at 20% of the cost, you usually have to take that, especially at the defense. Yeah, it's a downgrade, but you saved yourself a bunch of money that you can then use elsewhere to go sign another player that makes your team better.
See,
And
the Seahawks are in a unique situation with Jamal Adams specifically regarding that argument you just made, in that it doesn't really necessarily apply to Jamal because he hasn't been on the field. Here's a guy that you're paying a boatload of money, and he's missed, gosh, Keith, maybe 27, 28 games in the last 3 years.
mhm,
And
and
that's a lot. That's
almost
significant.
the entire season this year. So
And at $18 million.
yeah, you
And,
got it.
prior he was making 9 or 10 on his rookie deal. When that ended, he's been making 18 the last 2 seasons.
Mhm.
And it's, you can't do that year in, year out, and then expect something different next year because he's going to heal. He's going to be ready. You're still putting that out, and you've now got a player on the roster that is doing the job. And I think it's time that you just move on. You cut your losses. You be able to transfer that money back either at the quarterback position or in the trenches where we really need the help. So
Yep. And so
anyway,
you look at that, and like I said, they got essentially no production out of Jamal Adams this year, and so that cutting him in that post June 1st method, where you get 11 millions of savings, like you have $11 million, and replacing his production is already done because you got no production.
yes.
So that's a really easy, math to do. I can replace Jamal Adams's production with $0, which leaves me 11 million extra to go spend elsewhere.
How much, and this will be the last question, and we'll get out of here. How much do you feel the team is dependent upon Jamal Adams in this scheme to be the player that he is? And is he worth holding on to if they could somehow restructure his deal?
I don't think they're dependent on him at all. And I would say no, because um, I mean, how can you say they're dependent on him when they played all year without him?
Well, I think
Um,
you and I both know, and I think, early on, let's just say the first 2 or 3 games, we recognized that the defense was not working. And we may have attributed that to the fact that they were expecting Jamal Adams to be there when he wasn't. That was part of the reason.
okay. I guess you can say scheme wise, they planned for Jamal Adams and then didn't have him. And Ryan Neal's a different player. I would argue that Ryan Neal's the better player. And that's part of the reason why I think that they're not dependent on Jamal Adams, and restructuring him and kicking this can down the road and stretching this problem, which is his bloated contract, out over more seasons is counterproductive. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it's that
Take
post
your
June
medicine
1st.
and just get it
Yep.
done.
It's that post June 1st designation. Yeah, that's going to leave them with, um, some dead money the following year, but you can replace what he does for you. Now, Jamal Adams can be a special player. There's a reason why he's being paid that. There's a reason why he was a two-time All-Pro before his 26th birthday. But he hasn't been that guy in Seattle. I mean, they got a bunch of sacks out of him once. But he hasn't been good in coverage, and they're just not getting as much out of him, in part just because he's always hurt. His playing style, where he just throws his body
Mm-hmm.
into guys, um, is the type where he's going to have injuries. And I basically, he can be a special player if used right for a short period of time. Um, But if you use him right, he's going to get hurt because you play to his skill set. You play to also his vulnerability, which is the injuries. And so I think at this point, you just have to bite the bullet. You got to do it and know that you're actually fine with Ryan Neal because he's far better in coverage. Been one of the better strong safeties in the NFL this last year. And I know people will be like, "Oh, that's just you being a homer," but go look at Pro Football Focus. Go look at the other advanced metrics. His coverage skills are really good for a strong safety, and
Pro
it
Football
mattered.
Focus has him as a pro, not a Pro Bowler, an All Pro.
An
At
All
that
Pro.
spot, the best
Wow.
at the position.
That I'm surprised he's that high because there's some really good strong safeties in the league, but his coverage skills are elite.
Yeah,
I mean,
he had a
he's a
Pro Football
cornerback.
Focus grade of like 87 overall.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean. Like you can get that for 4.3, or you can have Jamal Adams for 4 games for 18, or 5 games, or 6 games.
And we need the money. Here's the bottom line. We're going to need that money, whether it goes to Geno or whether it goes to Daron Payne or some other guy, in free agency. So, all right. I think let's wrap this thing up. Good conversation. I'm sure we'll have it again, especially as we get close to free agency. We'll kind of rehash what we've got, what we're able to do. We'll talk about the moves as they come up, as we go through the weeks. And then our next show is going to be centric around the quarterback position for the Seahawks. What does Seattle do? Geno's had a great year. They're unrestricted. They don't have any quarterbacks under contract this next season. How about Drew Lock? But Geno is the big key to the puzzle in the offseason. It's going to have potentially the biggest impact as far as financially to this franchise, as far as their philosophy on which direction that they go as a franchise. Are they in win now mode? Are they going to lock Geno up for 3 or 4 years and give him all the money and all that? Or are they going to play hardball with Geno and let him test the market and potentially go into the season having Geno left in free agency with Drew Lock potentially as the only guy under contract as they head into the draft? Seems unlikely to me. What are the other options out there in free agency? All those questions. So anyway, that's it.
Yeah, good show.
Yeah, good show. All right. Find Keith on Twitter at Myers NFL. You can find me at NWChawk. You know where the show's at. Find us on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube. Hit that subscribe button and share it. Until next time, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NWChawk, Keith is at Myers NFL, and the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.